Welcome guys. This is going to be your final video for Year 11 Legal Studies. In this particular video, we're going to be looking at human rights and the way I guess human rights are protected in Australia. For this particular topic, we just need to know 3 key knowledge points, but as a bit of a heads up, this is probably the most challenging topic of all 6 in Year 11 Legal Studies, because a lot of the stuff you're going to be seeing in this video goes on to Unit 4 Legal Studies if you are planning to do legal next year. So I'll do my best to work through these first 2 key knowledge points in the first video, and then we'll touch on this second one in the next video, and also practice a few key skills. So from the start, last time I'm going to show you this sort of slide. It is really important that you remember and keep getting into the habit of using your task words effectively. So big 2 that I'm going to be focusing on across this series is the use of the word evaluate. It's a very common question you'll get for this particular topic. And also distinguish, which hopefully you guys remember that when you do see the word distinguish between 2 things. We've got to use the word difference in our answer and explain, I guess, what the different features or characteristics of a certain concept is. So getting stuck right in. Really important, you just have a general definition about what human rights are. So I guess the way I kind of think about them, is they're basically just basic entitlements that every single person should have in society, regardless of whatever situation they're in. So like I've got here, regardless of the background, what they look like, where they live, anything like that. They're based on our basic values of freedom and equality and dignity. And I guess what we're trying to have with human rights is we're trying to protect our quality of life. So I would really encourage that you have just a nice simple definition like this to help refer to rights. So some general rights that we have in Australia, there's obviously many more than this, but the right to life, the right to a fair trial. We don't have any torture in Australia generally, and obviously freedom of religion is a common one as well. So just make sure, have a definition of human rights and be aware of some certain ways that human rights are protected. The next part we have is what's known as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So this is an agreement that Australia signed quite some time ago, about 70 plus years ago, and it basically sets out many of our basic human rights. So in this document, if you do open it up, it contains what's known as 30 articles. They're kind of like 30 sections that outline 30 different ways our rights should be protected. And because there are so many countries involved in this Universal Declaration, a lot of people really respect it and try and uphold this as best as possible. So one section that this particular Universal Declaration has is it has Article 5, that no one shall be subjected to torture, cruel or inhumane or degrading treatment or punishment. So by having a declaration that all these countries follow, it kind of keeps each other accountable to make sure we're doing the right thing and upholding human rights in Australia. So I guess in general, Australia's role of human rights, we have signed many international treaties, which are legally binding agreements that protect our human rights. But obviously for our human rights to be kind of binding, Parliament has to pass laws to make sure we can incorporate these particular rights. But like I mentioned on that last slide as well, we've also signed declarations like the Declaration of Human Rights, but these aren't legally binding. So there aren't as much consequences, or they're quite difficult to enforce if countries do decide to breach a declaration. All right, so that's kind of a general overview about our rights in Australia. This is probably the most challenging part of this topic. So rights are protected in Australia in 3 main ways. So we need to really make sure we know these 3 main mechanisms or 3 main ways in quite a bit of detail to ensure we can answer our questions effectively. So the first one we're going to look at is common law and statute law. So just to remind you, when you see common law, think about this as laws made by courts. When you see statute law, these are laws made by Parliament. Okay, so the first one we have is what's known as statute law. So in Australia, we have regular elections and we are voting for who we want to represent our views and values. So people in Parliament are pretty much able to make laws that can help uphold or protect our rights. So their job is to sit in Parliament and make laws that represent our views and values, and through doing that, they generally will make laws that will often protect our rights, enhance our rights, stop things that might, be discriminatory against our human rights. The next one we have is common law. Very similar idea. Common law is just laws made by judges. It's a little bit different because Parliament can make laws whenever they please. That is their main responsibility. Judges are only able to make laws when a case is brought before them. So when the judge sees that there has been a human rights breach, for example, they can create what's known as a precedent or a new law. And what this will do is it will protect human rights for future cases. So we've had many court cases that have gone through our system in the past, and some of them have included giving us things like the right to silence to help protect us from incriminating ourselves, and the right to a fair trial. So I'm sure in the future we'll continue to have more cases going through court, which will help to protect and enhance our human rights in Australia. But I guess one thing to note about this, we will get into a bit later, but like I said at the start, courts are not able to make any law unless there is a case before them. That's a bit of a limitation of them. All right, moving on to your second protection, which is the Victorian Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities. This is primarily based at, as you can imagine, protecting the rights of Victorians. And it basically sets out, kind of like the declaration I was talking about before, it sets out some basic rights, freedoms and responsibilities for all people that live in Victoria. And because it's an actual act, it creates a lot of protection for us. So as you can see on this box here, here's just some of the examples of how it protects our human rights in Victoria. But it's a really effective way that helps further protect our rights. And as you're starting to see from this theme, we have multiple different means or multiple different methods where our rights are protected. All right, moving on to the Constitution. This is probably the trickiest part of this topic, so I'm going to do my best to sort of explain it in as simple terms as possible. But basically, the Constitution is a document that was written quite some time ago. It's probably the most important document we have in this country because what it does is it outlines how our country is governed, so how particular laws are supposed to be made. It sets out the lawmaking powers of parliamentary bodies. So it sets out what powers our federal parliament has, what powers our state parliament has, and where can they make laws in specific areas. And lastly, it establishes a specific set of rights that cannot be taken away from us without our permission. So these are known as our express rights. We have 5 of them, and because they are written in the Constitution, they help to protect us. So for this particular topic, I would really recommend taking some notes as you're watching this video because there is quite a bit of information coming your way. So with the Australian Constitution, it protects us in 3 main ways. It protects us through our express rights, which I just mentioned, our one implied right, and it also includes some structural protections as well, which helps to enhance and promote our human rights as well. So our first protection in the Constitution is known as an express right. So these are basically sections in the Constitution that you can open up and find them physically there. They are limiting the power of the Commonwealth, and by limiting the power of the Commonwealth, they basically protect our rights as Australian people. The most important thing to really note about express rights is they are what's known as they are entrenched or written in the Constitution. So what that means is because they are physically in the Constitution, the only way that these rights can be taken away from us is through what's known as a referendum, which I'm going to explain on the next slide. So in Australia, we have 5 express rights, such as freedom of religion, and they're very difficult to take away, but also it's very difficult to add new express rights because of this referendum process. So to paint a picture for you, hypothetically, if we wanted to take away the right to freedom of religion in Australia, we would need what's known as a referendum. So if we were to remove that freedom of religion right, we would need more than half of Australian voters to say, yes, we want to remove that vote. So that's really difficult to achieve in itself. But also, the second part we need to achieve a successful referendum is that we need a majority of voters in at least 4 out of 6 states to vote yes. So this is what's known as a double majority. And if we do not achieve a double majority, a referendum cannot be successful. So as you can imagine, if we did try and remove freedom of religion, it's going to be very unlikely for this to pass because of how hard it would be to achieve these 2 things here. And to give you a statistic which we'll talk about a little bit later, we've had 45 referendums in Australia and only 8 of them have been successful. So it's really, really hard to change the wording of the Constitution or remove something from the Constitution. So as I mentioned, we have 5 express rights here. Generally, my advice for your assessment task is I would try and remember 2 to 3. I don't think it's necessary most of the time to remember all 5, but here all 5 of them are. The numbers next to the express right refers to which section of the Constitution they are located. And I'm just going to show you 2 of them, but feel free to look into the other 3 in your textbook. So first one, pretty straightforward, freedom of religion. Basically, like it says, it stops the Commonwealth from imposing a religion on you, from forcing you to follow a religion, or from not following you, not allowing you to follow a religion. And it basically prohibits the Commonwealth from making laws that maybe establish a statewide or Commonwealth religion or banning religion. So pretty straightforward. Next example of an express right is trial by jury. What's really important to note is this is not for general cases. This is only for Commonwealth indictable offences, so very specific offences like terrorism related cases. And they're obviously, like it says, for indictable, it's only for serious offences. It's not for our summary or minor offences. The next part we have in our Constitution is what's known as an implied right. So implied rights are different to express rights because they're not explicitly stated in the wording of the Constitution. So what that means is that if you open up the Constitution, you will see the 5 express rights. You will not see our 1 implied right. We only have 1, which is freedom of political communication. And I guess what I wanted to say about implied rights is that we can actually get more, a little bit easier than express rights. It just requires someone to take it to the High Court and prove a particular implied right exists. So a really important skill you need to know for this particular topic is to be able to differentiate between the 2. And I've kind of broken it down very simply for you. Express rights, written or entrenched in the Constitution. Implied rights are not. But like I said, we can get more as a result of a High Court case. I just wanted to show you this slide here. This is how we got our 1 and only implied right in Australia. So as you can see, it was quite some time ago in 1992, but how the process of gaining more implied rights works is that the Commonwealth makes a law, for example, that is unconstitutional. For example, they made a law banning political ads on TV before elections. Someone said, that's breaching our human rights, and they take it to what's known as the High Court. The High Court basically interprets that we do have the implied right as a result of the case, and then we gain the implied right, and the unconstitutional law is declared invalid. So definitely don't need to know this case for your particular assessment task, but it's just to kind of show you how we gain more implied rights in Australia. The last protection in the Constitution is what's known as structural protection of rights. I think this one is pretty straightforward. Just to explain, it's made up of 3 things. The first one is representative government. So like it kind of says in the name, people in government are there to represent our views and values. So the way they do that in Australia is because we're a democracy, we have regular elections. So obviously, if someone is not representing the views of the majority of the people, chances are that particular person will get voted out in the next election. So I guess it keeps members of parliament really trying to push to make sure they keep reflecting and upholding our views and values as a society. The next one we have is what's known as responsible government. It's pretty similar, in my opinion, to representative government, but what it's basically kind of doing is it puts a lot of pressure on members of parliament to be accountable. And I guess if someone is failing to do their duty to represent people of their electorate, for example, the Minister for Education is doing a really poor job, they're expected to resign, and it really just keeps everyone in Parliament accountable to keep doing their job correctly for the foreseeable future when they are in power. The last one for structural protections is what's known as separation of powers. The best way I kind of explain this one is that we're not like a dictatorship at all. So in a dictatorship structure, one person or one body controls all power. So as you can imagine, that could get out of control quite quickly. So in Australia, we kind of have three separate branches of lawmaking power. And the big reason we do that is because we don't want someone having what's known as absolute or all of the power. Because if someone controls every single aspect, so how the laws are made, administered, and how they're resolved, this can lead to a lot of abuse of power. So it's just a structure we have in the Constitution to kind of make sure, it's split evenly in terms of power. So this diagram is probably the best way to explain it for you. In Australia, we have three main branches of power. We have the people that make the law, which is known as our legislative branch. We have the executive branch. These are people responsible for implementing and administering the laws, so like our Minister for Education or Minister for Health. And lastly, we have the people that are there to enforce the law and settle the disputes. So as you can see from these branches, they're all really as separate as possible to make sure that we are not getting one person, making the laws and resolving the laws. It keeps everyone independent and makes sure we don't get that abuse of power as mentioned.